الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Holy Quran, and what he says is the truth. Allah says, سنريهم آياتنا في الآفاق وفي أنفسهم حتى يتبين لهم أنه الحق أولم يكفي بربك أنه على كل شيء شهيد. So we continue with this beautiful verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and surely we will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes apparent and clear to them that He is the truth. Is it not sufficient for you that Allah bears witness over all things? Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. As we continue our discourse, we were able to, through the intellect, to reach certain realities and certain truths that have strengthened our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Paradigm shifting ideas and paradigm shifting processes of thought that have allowed us to now change or at least alter or let's say tweak our moral compass. We've come to understand that really the reason why we are here is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a privilege, it's an honor that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed upon us. Why? Because He is the all-perfect. We said the creator of something is greater than what they create. Therefore the creator of all of limitation is greater than limitation, which means that He is unlimited. And that means that He is all-perfect, right? So since He is all-perfect, that means then that not only is He all-wise, but He's all-just. And that means that any oppression we see in the world is not from our Creator, but rather from the doings of our own hands, from human choice. So once we come to understand this, it becomes easy to be able to navigate through life. Because I won't be questioning, well, why is it that God has allowed this to happen? Why? Because we said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to give us choice because choice is good and being forced to do something is bad. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala won't compel us. He won't force us, not even to choose Him. Because imagine if we were all compelled and we were all forced, then what's the point of this life in the first place? Life becomes pointless. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? Is all purposeful, since He's all perfect. Therefore, everything that we go through in this life is for a purpose. And that purpose, first and foremost, serves me. It doesn't serve my Creator, because He is not in need. He deemed me worthy of existing, and therefore my worth is from Him. Right? That means then, what must I do? I must thank Him. And thanking Him can be by me guessing or by me emulating Him, or it can also be by me asking Him, oh Allah, just like I communicate with others, aren't you going to communicate with me? So we reached the point where we understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to communicate with me. And we determined that there have to be criteria through which I can determine whether a message truly is from my Creator or not. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. So based on that then, I said, okay, well, let me think of certain criteria that I can use to be able to determine whether a message is truly from Allah or not. And so we were able to list a few criteria. And I'll list all 5 right now. Yesterday we were only able to do one of them. Today we'll, inshallah, do the second. So the 5 criteria are, number 1, that the message has to be a reflection of its author, right? And since the author is unlimited, that means he's constant, he's unchanged. That means his message must be constant and unchanged. We said, secondly, since he is unlimited, that means he's all perfect. Therefore, his message must be non-contradictory. It must have no mistakes, no errors. Because he is perfect, his message must be perfect as well. We also mentioned that since He is supernatural and beyond nature, He is the creator of all of limitation. That means that His message must also be supernatural, meaning miraculous, right? We also mentioned 2 other important criteria. One is that the Creator Himself must, in His message, correct any false claims that were made by either scholars of past religions or otherwise. And also finally, that the message itself must have information in it that nobody would know about the universe except for the Creator Himself. We were able to determine, after we were able to understand the Bible and the Torah, that the Torah doesn't exist anymore, and that the Bible today was written 100 to 1300 years after the what we say as Muslims, the raising of Jesus to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we don't believe that he was crucified. That means then that we have to look at the Holy Quran, because the Torah and the Bible are not constant, right? They don't exist today in their original form. Next, we looked at the Holy Quran. We said, well, the Quran exists today. And if we compare a Quran from 1400 years ago, 800, 300, 200, 100, to this very day, wherever you go in the world, the Quran in its original language is exactly the same. Completely unchanged, right? To the harakah, to the short vowel. Now you might see certain changes in font depending on the time period or the country that you might see it in, but everything is exactly the same. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. Next, we move on to the second criterion. And that criterion, we said, is that the message has to be perfect. So even though at this point we can set the Torah and the Bible aside, we won't. Okay? We'll still see, do they meet the second criteria or not, just to be fair, right? So since the Torah today doesn't exist, and our brothers from the Jewish faith, they use, we mentioned the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 Gospels within the Old Testament as their Jewish Bible, then we'll look at the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Okay? And since the Christians, they take the whole Bible, Old and New Testaments, then that means then we can hit, 2 birds, inshallah, with 1 feather, not 1 stone. We don't want to hurt anyone, right? So that then we can be aware and see if there are any contradictions in both. And then, of course, we'll take a look at the Holy Quran. Okay? So if we look at the Old Testament, and if you remember, we said the Bible is composed of 2 testaments, the Old and the New, Al-Ahd al-Qadim and Al-Ahd al-Jadid. Now, in the Old Testament, the very first gospel is called Genesis, the Gospel of Genesis. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 1, it says, and Noah was the most righteous of his generation, and that God commanded him to enter the ark. Okay? Because remember, Noah was building this huge ark, this huge ship, where he would bring one of each pair of animals and so on, and only the believers would get onto the ship with him, and all kitabis, meaning those who follow the books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we believe this, right? We believe in the story of Prophet Noah. So it says then in chapter 7 verse 1 that Noah was the most righteous to his generation. Now these words, they sound very godly, right? Because if he is the most righteous of his generation, then he must be a prophet to his people. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense, right? So if God says you're the most righteous, then who's better than you on the earth? There isn't, right, Hajj? So based on that then, we say, okay, great. So according to the Bible, according to Genesis chapter 7 verse 1, Noah was a prophet of God. He was the most righteous of his people. Next, if we move on to chapter 9 verses 20 to 25, we find a really interesting scenario unfolding. And it says that basically, and I'll paraphrase, that when the ark of Noah landed, Noah became a husbandman and he planted a vineyard. Interesting. If he is a prophet of God, why would he plant a vineyard? Aren't vineyards for winemaking? We say, okay, no, well, let's read on. Maybe, it's just, when you have an orchard, a grape orchard, maybe that's what it's called, a vineyard. If we read on, we find that there's this scenario that occurs where one of the sons of Noah enters his tent and he finds him unclothed, uncovered, naked, not wearing any clothes. Okay, you might say, well, he's in the privacy of his own tent, right? It's okay if he takes off his clothes. But that's not the problem. The problem is that it continues to say, and that he was drunk. Drunk? I thought he was the most righteous in chapter 7 verse 1. Why is it that in chapter 9 verses 20 to 25 it says he planted a vineyard and he's uncovered in his tent and he's drunk? Al-'ayadhu billah. How can a prophet of God partake in being drunk and drinking? That doesn't sound right, does it? So there's an obvious contradiction here in the Old Testament. Now, someone might come to you and they might say to you, well, what if drinking wasn't prohibited at that time? Right? Because someone can come and say that to you. So then we say, okay, well, let's look at the Old Testament and see, was drinking wine and alcohol prohibited or not? So when we look at the Gospel of Proverbs, what do we find in chapter 20, verse 1, in chapter 23, verse 32, in chapter 23, verses 20 and 21, okay? It speaks about wine. And what does it say? And be not among wine bibbers, riotous eaters of flesh. Let's take a look at this verse. Be not among wine bibbers, meaning don't be amongst people who do what? Who drink wine. And not just wine bibbers. A wine bibber is a person who literally spills wine every time they drink, which means they drink a lot. So that means then, if it says do not be amongst wine bibbers, amongst itself as a word can either mean don't be one of them or don't even be around them. So to be precautious, it's better to say don't even be around them. Does that make sense? Which means avoid such individuals. Because it would be unrighteous behavior to be associated with such individuals. Does that make sense? So if it says don't be amongst them, around them, avoid them, then of course by priority it would mean don't drink. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, say it makes sense. Next, what does it say? It says, and wine is a mocker, and whomsoever is deceived is unwise. That wine humiliates a person, makes a mockery out of them. And whoever is deceived by this drink is considered to be unwise. So how can he be righteous and unwise at the same time? How could this most righteous person of his generation allow a simple drink to make a mockery of him and to humiliate him, as is depicted in the tent where he was uncovered and found drunk by his son? Wal-'iyadhu billah. Right? That doesn't make any logical sense, right? So obviously, we're seeing that so far there is truly a contradiction. And Proverbs is making it clear for us, right, that drinking wine is prohibited. Not just that, what do we find? We find in another verse, it describes what alcohol and drinking does to you. Also in Proverbs, what does it say? It biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder. So what does a serpent do? It bites its prey, it wraps itself around it, right? Takes a hold of it, suffocates the living daylights out of it. And if it's as venomous as a snake, that means it's poisonous. Agreed? If you agree, say I agree. And we all know that alcohol poisons your liver, right? Burns brain cells, right? So obviously then, the Bible is clear in telling us that drinking is prohibited. Agreed so far? So then there is an obvious contradiction here in the Old Testament, being the Jewish Bible, and the Bible itself. So let's look at the chapter of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 15. In this verse of the New Testament now we're in the New Testament, okay? The New Testament now, what does it say? It says, and it speaks about Prophet Yahya, okay? And he was great in the sight of his Lord. And he neither drank wine nor strong drink. So Yahya was a prophet of God. And he, according to that verse, was great in the sight of the Lord. Wow. That means he was a prophet. Agreed? So these sound like the words of God. So if we read on, what does it say? And he neither drank wine nor strong drink. Which means that a prophet of God does not drink wine and does not drink strong drink. Which means any drink that has alcohol in it. Not a rum and coke, not vodka, nothing like that. Okay? So that means that all prophets, because if this applies to one prophet, then all prophets have to be this way. Because they all represent God. Agreed? So based on that then, that means that clearly there is a contradiction within the Old Testament and between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, while some of the words sound godly, and Noah was the most righteous of his generation, right? Sounds godly. And he was great in the sight of the Lord. Sounds godly, right? But unfortunately, there are contradictions. Now, why did this happen? Well, you have to understand that these Gospels of the Bible, there are many of them. Some were included, some were removed because of whatever reason. We'll talk about that later. But these Gospels, nobody claims that they were written by Jesus. Everybody will tell you that these Gospels were written by normal men. Some are associated with the disciples of Jesus. Okay? Even those books themselves, some say that it wasn't the disciples, but rather their students who wrote them. But 85%, at least, of the Gospels were written by unknown authors. So now, if a message is a reflection of its author, and we don't know who the author is, then how can we authenticate that this is truly the Word of God? What they do tell us is this: the Spirit entered them and guided their hand to write. Well, listen, if you write a book, and I write a book, and the other writes a book, right? We're different people. We have different styles of writing, right? Agreed? And maybe we have different patrons who paid for us to write these books. And maybe those patrons have political motivations, right? Part of it might be to corrupt people's thoughts. And so to corrupt the idea of the perfection of a prophet and the representative of God is clear here in those specific groupings of verses from chapter 9, verses 20 to 25. Agreed? Obviously, someone is trying to discredit, right, the prophets and the representatives of God. And so that's why we say, look, while the Bible does have some elements that sound godly, but because there are contradictions in it, we can't take it. Including the other reason why is because we don't know who all the authors are anyway, right? So by your own admission, so then I can't take the Bible because it has contradictions. And I can't take the Torah as well. So now I move on to the Holy Quran. Does the Holy Quran have contradictions in it? No one has found a contradiction in the Holy Quran. Not a single contradiction. And those who have come and tried to claim that there is a contradiction, at the end of the road, they've been refuted. The simplest one is they come and they say what? They say, well, the Holy Quran states in it, and whoever gives life to one individual, for he has given life to all of humanity, and whoever takes one life has killed all of humanity, right? They say, doesn't that contradict with kill all the infidels? We say, first of all, there's no such word as infidels in the Holy Quran. And the verse that they are referring to, the second verse, actually refers to, because we can't take verses out of context, right? Okay, just like we didn't take the verses out of context in the Torah, in the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, we can't take things out of context when we look at any text, right? Or even when we talk to anyone, right? We don't take just a little excerpt and then say, oh, this is the reason why, and just make up a reason, right? Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. In actual fact, the verse that they're referring to refers to the mushrikeen of Mecca, that they were trying to push the believers out of Mecca, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to hold their ground and to protect themselves. And if you continue reading the verse, and inshallah we'll talk about it in more detail tomorrow, if you continue reading the verse, you'll find that it actually tells you that Allah says, and don't be the initiator, and don't fight them in front of al-Masjid al-Haram. And if they stand down, then just forgive them. Right? So then there is no contradiction in the Holy Quran. So based on that, then the Holy Quran passes the first two criteria. Now what we have is three more criteria to look at. Inshallah, we'll take a look at those. Tomorrow, though, we'll take a break from looking at the criteria. We will cover chaos theory and coincidence. Sounds good? Until then, we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our deeds, that He bestows His mercy upon our dear departed relatives, that He supports our dear brothers and sisters that make programs like this happen, whether it was in the past or today or in the future, inshallah. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removes oppression from all those who are oppressed. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives health to our sick. And we ask that Allah hastens the appearance of Imam al-Hujjah, salamullahi alayhi, and He makes us of His willful servants. بعونه تعالى وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين والفاتحة على أرواح المرحومين من أموات الحاضرين ومن أموات المؤمنين والمؤمنات مسبوقة مشروعة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.